All right, thank you for joining us today for LCB's 5th deliberative dialogue concerning evaluation of THC compounds. Would ask that folks please turn off your cameras and stay on mute unless you are a panelist. And if you are a panelist, please go ahead and join us at this point. We'd appreciate seeing you. I'll go ahead and run through the agenda really briefly and then bring up our PowerPoint presentation that will kind of guide our conversation this afternoon. And then we'll go into the dialogue session with our panelists and then move into the open questions section that will involve our participants today. So without any further ado, I just want to spend a moment looking at the agenda today. We'll just go through this brief introductory period for 5 or 10 minutes and then move to introductions, including a panel introduction, and then begin our moderated panel discussion, hoping to get to our moderated panel discussion a little bit before 1:50. And then we'll open up the floor for questions from our panelists at that time. So I'd like to move into the PowerPoint presentation now, if I may. All right, we will go until 3 o'clock today, and thanks again for joining us. And we're trying to keep our dialogues down to a little bit shorter period of time. We know they can get can be hard to hang on for 2 or 3 hours, so trying to keep them a little shorter than we have in the past. And for some reason, this isn't advancing. There we go. All right, so our overall meeting goal today is to build an understanding of how we might determine and define what THC compounds are and are not impairing. And so our intentions today are to provide a continued platform for our panelists to share and discuss perspectives. So why are we here today? LCB issued a policy statement last April concerning THC compounds. We adopted a new rule section after the first of the year this year that identified definitions for things like additive, solvent, ingredient, those kinds of things. 2022 legislation would have added additional definitions, but that legislation did not advance. And now we'd like to continue that discussion to inform policy and rule development moving forward. So our data today will be added to an Excel workbook. We'll share those the comments we've received and the information we gleaned today with the board and with the public. And then we'll also share recordings and comments externally on our outward-facing webpage. So our meeting protocol today, really briefly, our panelists today are Steve Frank, Dr. Bia Carlini, and Dr. Jillian Schauer. I'll be your moderator today. I'm Kathy Hoffman, Policy and Rules Manager for LCB. And then those of you joining us, we're happy to welcome you today as participants and listeners in this process. I'm going to stop really briefly there and welcome our policy and our Director of Policy and Stakeholder Engagement, Justin Nordhorn, to offer a few comments.
Yeah, thanks, Kathy. Just echoing what Kathy said, this is a really long-term work in progress. So we started this last spring trying to get things moving forward on the policy side of the equation. We had 2 deliberative dialogues last year. This is our 3rd this year. So really appreciate everybody's participation, listening, and then following up with any ideas and concerns about the pathway forward. So appreciate the panelists. Thank you so much for sharing your time today. It's so much appreciated to have the expertise coming in. So I'll leave it there and we'll get to the meat of it. Thanks, Kathy.
Great, thanks, Justin. Just really briefly, I know that many of you have joined us for these deliberative dialogues to this point, but I just want to emphasize again that deliberative dialogue involves listening deeply to other points of view, exploring new ideas and perspectives, and searching for points of agreement and bringing our unexamined assumptions into the open and talking those through to the extent possible. There's a link here. We will share the slide deck after this meeting today, so you can read through what Scott London has to say about deliberative dialogue and its usefulness and helpfulness to us in this process. Just to quickly contrast, I know for those of you who have been with us before, this is probably old news, but for those of you who are new participants, just kind of highlighting the difference between deliberative dialogue and debate, and just really want to emphasize here that we really are listening to find points where we agree so we can build on those and move forward. So not going to spend a lot of time on this slide, but certainly encourage folks to take a look at this in their leisure. And then what are the ground rules for our conversation today? And this is kind of a restatement of the table that you just saw, but really the dialogue today is to help us understand and learn from each other, from the differing perspectives that we bring to this conversation. And just really ask that folks listen carefully and respectfully to all the points of view that we'll hear today. Look for common ground. And really respect all points of view. And again, even though I've already let everyone know that this is a public work session and it's being recorded, just another reminder that it is. And we'll put that recording up on our outward-facing website. All right, so format today. I'll introduce the panel and then let them share a little bit about themselves with you. Then we'll start a moderated panel discussion, and then we'll have the participant discussion after the moderated discussion just between the panelists. Please use the hand raise feature to let us know you have a question. And then you can also put questions into the chat box during the session that's being moderated, but we won't get to those until the open questions section. All right, so let's go ahead and start with hearing from our participants. So in the chat box, if you could let us know who you are, if comfortable, who you're affiliated with or represent, and why you're interested in this topic, we'd really like to know. And then let's move into panelist introductions. So let's start with Dr. Carlini.
Hi, I'm Bia Carlini, and I really appreciate being called to participate in this dialogue today. I am a social psychologist by training with a degree in public health as well, and have been working at ADAI, an institute in the psychiatry department of the School of Medicine, University of Washington, for about 11 years now. Always had a passion to understand how substances that are used in a legal manner affect society, risk and well-being. And when cannabis was legalized, I incorporated as my of one of the substances I study and currently is my main topic. So I really appreciate being here and have the opportunity to talk.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing your afternoon with us. We really appreciate it. So, Mr. Frang.
Thank you, Kathy. I'm Steve Frang. I'm representing the Washington Association for Substance Abuse and Violence Prevention, a statewide association. Professionally, I worked for some years for the Seattle-King County Department of Public Health, concluding with the position of manager for the Division of Alcoholism and Substance Abuse Services. And then more recently, concluded my tenure as the manager for prevention and treatment initiatives for the Northwest High Intensity Drug Trafficking Area, which is one of 33 geographic regions supported by the Office of National Drug Control Policy. I had an interesting process taking advantage of my doctorate in clinical psychology with a emphasis on chemical dependencies. With one foot in the prevention world and one foot in the treatment world, it's been a benefit, I think, for me in terms of the perspective I have in some of the issues, including this one.
Great, thank you so much. And again, thank you for your time this afternoon. We really appreciate it. And then finally, Jillian Shower, I believe I see your circle, but if you could turn on your camera and introduce yourself, that would be great.
Yeah, thanks, Kathy. Jillian Shower, I'm the Executive Director of the Cannabis Regulators Association. We are a nonpartisan, not-for-profit 501c4, and we convene government officials involved in cannabis regulation across more than 40 states and territories. Our members are government only. We focus on an exchange of information, and we have as some of our tenets protecting consumer safety, promoting equity, and creating predictability in markets for market participants. With that said, I will not be speaking on behalf of CANRA today. I will definitely be representing some of what's happening in states, but the opinions I present today are my own and not an official position of CANRA. I have a PhD in behavioral science and a master in public health, and have worked in the cannabis space for the last decade and have worked on drug policy for 2 decades now. So really happy to be part of what I think is a challenging topic, and interested to hear the discussion and the questions from the audience. Thanks, Kathy.
Thank you, Jillian. All right, so yes, we are moving a little ahead of schedule, which is great. For folks who are still introducing yourselves in the chat, please continue to do that, but we're going to go ahead and take advantage of this extra 3 minutes that we have with our panel to talk about the issue that we're here to discuss today, or the question that we want to discuss today, and that is, from your perspectives, how might we determine and define what is and is not impairing? And just by way of background, we've had a total of 5 deliberative dialogues. The first 2 had to do really with cannabis plant chemistry, and more recently we've had a series of 3 that focus on 3 different perspectives. The first was from our trusted scientists and experts from the scientific perspective. The last deliberative dialogue concerned perspectives of Washington State Patrol and other law enforcement perspectives. Now we're turning to the 3 of you from your perspectives. And it's not necessarily that we're trying to use the word impairing, but how might we determine what causes that sort of change in a person with respect to how THC compounds might affect them. So anyone want to take a first stab at that? I know we had a really great discussion for our prep meeting on Friday about the perspectives that you might bring to this. And I think, Dr. Carlini, you spoke a bit about really focusing on risk and safety around THC compounds and what they do. So maybe you could start us off there.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so my thoughts, not being following the discussion closely, was to try to think outside the word impairing, actually, as maybe a different way of looking at these compounds. We're really focusing on what is the potential risks of their use. The issue about impairing is that you may be impaired but not at risk, and you may be at risk and not impaired. And I think the focus should be the risk of experiencing harm, and harm happens in long and in short term. So you might be impaired and in the safety of your home, and experiencing a change of perception. Maybe your capacity of judging reality is not as sharp as it would be without the substance. You are under the influence, but I don't think that's what we are trying to regulate, or that's what should be the focus of regulation. We should be trying to focus the regulation of using, ingesting, in which circumstances product that can, after some years of use, for instance, equate on risk for behavior health, or for physical health, or for physical safety. At the same token, we should also be thinking of risk. Impairing is a useful word. You can think, if you're impaired to drive because you are using something, you are at risk of accident or to cause an accident. So impairing is a part of the idea of risk, but I don't think it should be central. So I just leave it at that. I can elaborate, but let's start with that. Like I'm moving a little bit the focus of impairing.
That sounds good. Others, feedback, thoughts?
Well, discussions of risk really bring to mind one of the primary focuses for the prevention community, which really is looking at youth and the risks and harms associated with youthful use of basically any psychoactive substance. I think we really need to put some attention to whether all THC-based products should come under the same umbrella. THC, apart from the discussion in regard to the word impairing, which could conceivably be seen as a red herring given the depth and complexity of the issues, really. All THC products are psychoactive. They affect cognition, affect, memory, perception, and orientation. I don't know that there's much differential in regard to products as concerns the risk, particularly as they're presented to children and youth.
So if I can jump in, I think, I'd like to start from sort of how have states approached this and where are the gaps? I think that's instructive and maybe why the discussion has gone to what is impairing. So in general, states that have addressed this topic have taken a couple different approaches. One is to, in statute, take a cannabinoid approach where they've actually defined in statute a broader definition of THC, or they've defined Delta 8 and they've brought that under the regulatory purview of adult use or medical use cannabis regulators. I think the challenge with that one that we've all discussed and that I suspect many on the line also are aware of is that then to keep up with innovation in the industry, you'd have to constantly go back to the statute and add additional cannabinoids as they came into the fold and were deemed to be something that should be regulated in medical or adult use markets. So that's maybe not an ideal approach because of what that would require in terms of just lawmaking. A couple states have taken a broader approach, including Oregon, where they defined adult use cannabinoid and their definition was broad. And gave authority to the regulator to determine, I believe it's any artificially derived cannabinoid that's reasonably determined to have an intoxicating effect. And they did not have to define intoxicating. And then what we're seeing in a couple states is them putting it all under the same umbrella. And I tend to like that approach. So New York and Michigan, for example, their adult use and medical use regulators now also regulate hemp. I think what's happened in practice and why there are consumer safety concerns is different umbrellas have been passed out to different state agencies, and there's still rain getting through. There are still gaps in what's under the umbrella. For example, in many states, the regulator for hemp is agriculture, and their purview is the growing purview. And then there's a medical and or an adult use cannabis regulator, and their purview are products that are destined for adult use or medical use markets. And that leaves a huge gap in regulation, a huge gray area. When all products are brought under the same regulatory umbrella, I think that in theory can allow the regulator to not maybe have to focus on impairing, but instead be able to focus on what's being regulated where and how and where are the gaps. What I personally like about that approach is consumer safety, I think, matters across the board, whether a product is impairing or not. We should want, CBD products to be tested and packaged and labeled in a way that tells consumers what they're consuming in the same way that we should want that for THC-based products or other cannabinoids. So I think when a regulator has authority for all of them, they maybe can start to look at what's the end use of the product, does it fit in this particular regulatory pathway or that particular regulatory pathway? We haven't gotten to sort of see how that plays out in New York or Michigan, but I think those will be really interesting states to watch because of the authority that they will have to look more broadly and not just at what's under their umbrella, if that makes sense.
And might I ask, in mentioning the state of Oregon, are they indeed banning synthetic cannabinoids as of July 1st?
So what Oregon and what other states like Nevada and Michigan have done is they've brought those cannabinoids under the umbrella of the adult use regulatory agency so that they can determine, is there a safe way of manufacturing these so that they can be available in adult use and or medical use markets. So the products like Delta-8, HHC, THCO acetate will no longer be available on the hemp marketplace in those states, but will be available if there is a safe pathway for manufacture that the regulator feels like they can provide good consumer safety and regulatory oversight over. Now, there's some other states that have outright banned Delta-8. And I think, the challenge with making these decisions and the challenge with drawing the line of what's impairing is we don't have good science. We don't have good science on what's impairing for whom, at what level. A lot of these compounds are brand new, or haven't been widely used and studied. So I think that's a challenge. My personal belief is anytime you outright ban something, you have to pay attention to what happens on the illicit market. So I think that's one of the reasons that you see a number of states deciding to put it under the purview of their adult use cannabis regulator and give the regulator authority to determine, can this product be manufactured safely? Can we eliminate byproducts? Can we set standards for safe manufacture, for packaging, for labeling, et cetera? And then it would be available on an adult use marketplace. It wouldn't be available everywhere that we see hemp-derived products being sold where they're readily available to youth.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Jillian. Any thoughts? May I call you by your first names? If you're okay with that, okay. Any additional thoughts, Bia, that you'd like to offer in response to what Jillian brought up? I think I know that Colorado has a task force established by legislation to look into what is and is not intoxicating. And it sounds like that's how they are going to address what Jillian referred to as the holes in the umbrella.
Yeah, Kathy, I was going to jump in and say there are two other approaches that I think have been proposed, one of which is being taken, and that's sort of the task force route. Which I think is valuable because I think in my discussions with folks, this is really hard. It's not something, to tell you the end of the story now, it's not something we're going to solve on this deliberative dialogue. It's something, it's going to require a lot of conversations about what are the resource and staffing needs for regulatory agencies, what are the industry needs in terms of predictability and sort of certainty in markets, what are the consumer safety needs so that consumers can have certainty that the products that they're using have been regulated. And I think that those discussions are extensive and can be had in a task force, hopefully effectively. So that's what Colorado is trying. And, I think everybody's going to be sort of watching what comes of that, and it will be a multidisciplinary task force. Their legislation, however, I should say, also allowed their current hemp regulator to take action immediately through rule to try to protect consumers while the task force is sort of deliberating on what happens over the longer term. The other approach that a number of folks, including folks in Washington, have proposed is one that would propose a chemical framework where, it quickly gets very scientific, but, drawing a line in the sand on what's impairing or not could depend on, does it bind to certain receptors? How strongly does it bind, et cetera? And I think there's merit in discussing that further. I think that framework generally presupposes that some compounds that are not found in nature, like THCO acetate, are not on the table and are not legal. Compounds like THCO acetate can, in the metabolite, can bind to receptors, but themselves may not bind to receptors without getting too technical. And in most states right now, compounds like THC, acetate, and HHC are still very much on the table, even though those are compounds that are not found in nature, and some might presuppose would be sort of caught up in the definition of synthetic cannabinoid in terms of K2 or spice. In most states, they're not. And in fact, I think some would argue that the Ninth Circuit Court decision about Delta 8 could broadly be read that those are derivatives of hemp and therefore also legal. So I think all of the compounds that are out there in markets are on the table for regulators to try to figure out how can we protect consumer safety, how can we regulate these, where should we regulate these. But those are definitely some other approaches that have been proposed and or are being pursued by states. The other issue that I don't know if we want to get into here or not is on THC thresholds. So we're not just talking about the compound or the cannabinoid and where to draw the limit in terms of, say, is something like Delta 8 or Delta 10 impairing or not. It's also where to draw the line in terms of hemp products that are legal by the definition of the Farm Bill, but can have very high amounts of THC in them legally because the Farm Bill drew the line as 0.3% THC on a dry weight basis. So you can concentrate a lot of THC into edible and beverage products, for example. And there we have seen a couple states draw the line in the sand. Oregon, for example, did it through rule and has determined that a serving size in the hemp marketplace would be 2 milligrams of THC up to 20 per package. I think they initially had proposed 0.5 milligrams. And then we just saw Minnesota through legislature draw the line in the sand at 5 milligrams per serving or 50 per package, which is, I should note, the same threshold that's been set in several states for adult use. So Minnesota's legislation effectively has created the same amount of THC on their hemp market as we see in many adult use marketplaces. So I think that's another wrinkle to this equation, that we're not just talking about cannabinoids, we're also talking about the Delta 9 THC that can be legally in hemp-derived products as well.
Thank you for that, Jillian. Yes, Steve, any thoughts about what Jillian has just shared there? The complexity of this issue it's pretty clear. Go ahead, Steve.
Well,
Yeah.
I don't mean to oversimplify it, but what comes to mind, for instance, is the manner in which opioids are regulated in this country. And essentially naturally derived opioids, semi-synthetic opioids, and fully synthetic opioids are all under the same umbrella. And they too have differing potencies, differing half-lives, differing clinical indications, but nonetheless are all cut from the same cloth. So I sometimes ponder how disparate the conversation around THC has gotten when there are analogous circumstances elsewhere in the culture that have simplified it greatly.
Oh, thank you. Go ahead, Bia.
Yeah, and things can get complicated very easily. And my fear, listening to all the wealth of knowledge that Jillian brings to the table, is that we, as people concerned and committed to protect the health of people and the safety of people, is that we get into this maze of option, into the rabbit hole of all these little details. And at some extent, they are important, of course, but in the ideal world, and I think we can get there, we are talking about products that there's not science enough behind to show they definitely cause harm, but there is science enough that it looks like they will, that we should be concerned with them. And when there is room for questioning and there is not scientific certainty, we should advance on saying we should pause. This is serious enough that we are talking about children's brain. We are talking about the life of others by people driving under influence of these products. It's serious enough that we should pause, even if we don't know if impairing or risk is the right word, or even if none of these words are important. So we see people that are concerned about the health of the people of Washington in a corner trying to defend ourselves to say we should do something. And I think what we should do now is, as a society, pause and think this is not okay. We should do an umbrella, stop any cannabinoid products to be sold in the way it is, and try to, instead of being sweating our way out of trying to find a solution, find a solution by first giving a stop on all these products being unregulated. I feel we are living in a reverse world, that the burden of the proof are the people that are trying to prevent the products to be out, and not the people that are bringing new products that nobody really asked them to be available to our children, to our vulnerable population. And we are having to prove they have risk instead of the people that are benefited from the sales having to prove they are safe. So that's what my concern is. It's almost being out of the discussion for a while. It's like, what are we doing here? I'm not even understanding how we got to this point. And I'm frustrated. I want a healthy industry for Washington State. I want a healthy economy for health, but I also desperately want healthy people, and the role of agencies, of public agencies, the role of universities, the role of prevention agencies is to protect people so people can be healthy in a society that has a healthy economy. And I'm like, what is going on here? So, to be very blunt. So
yeah, I think the challenge is that there's not a regulatory switch that can be flipped to say we're going to pause. So many, I don't know the count, but a number of adult use states have done that in their adult use markets. You know, at the onset of Delta 8, 18 months, 24 months ago, they were starting to say, hey, time out, we need to assess what these products are, if they fit within our regulatory structure, how they can be made safely. And some states said, we don't want these products in our adult use market right now until we can make that assessment. The challenge is that because nobody was named in most states to regulate hemp-derived products, they were named to regulate hemp as it's being grown, but not the products coming out of it. There's nobody to flip the switch and say, we're going to take a pause and figure out a safe route of manufacture for consumers. And I think that's been challenging for adult use and medical use regulators who want to protect consumer safety and who want to protect their markets, because I think there's a lot of consumer confusion about what comes from what market. We now have, a lot of counterfeit packaging, products that are derived from hemp that are being sold in very illicit ways, in addition to maybe more traditional kind of licit ways. That's creating confusion, I think, for consumers about what is this product? Is it safe? I see it has a universal symbol. It must be approved by the regulator. There's all this confusion, and the ability to flip the switch and say pause is not in many states with the medical or adult use regulator. And I think folks on the hemp side of the house would say it's not necessarily with them either, that they're regulating the grows and not what happens to the products after the farm. So it's a huge gray area where, to use my Seattle analogy, there's a lot of rain falling, like there's no umbrella up. So I think that's the challenge, is how do you put an umbrella up? And it's been legislative discussions. Most, state medical and adult use agencies don't have the ability to make rule to suddenly regulate something that hasn't been given to them. But I do think, again, to go back to Michigan and New York, this will be the benefit of them having everything under the same umbrella, to be able to identify gray areas, to be able to hit pause, to be able to move something from one lane to another, because they determine, this is not a risky product and can be regulated in this, less stringent way, or this is a risky product and needs to fall into this pathway.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm going to pause for a moment and turn over to Justin. Any questions that you'd like to pose, Justin, or want to make that time available?
No, not at this point. I think we're discussing the right things, so I'll stay quiet for now. Okay,
thank you. So So if we can, just wondering, when we talk about the state's role in manufacturing, thinking about that from the, and be it to your point that why don't we, it almost sounds like the burden should be on the manufacturer, not the state, to figure out what's in and what's out. Can you talk a little more about that?
We all strive to have responsible industries and a responsible society. So you have a product out, if you look at, you're going to put new tires or you're going to develop tires from a new materials, you have a lot of rules you have to follow to be able to sell this product and not to cause accident. This is not in place with these new products. As Gillian has mentioned, it's very complicated. It's a lot of gray area. Who has the right to do what? I don't have, I don't live in the space of regulation, so it's not that I have the solution. So I really bring here, like, let's step back and look a little bit at what the options are. I would like to see, the industry actually pausing a little bit and bringing to us the certainty and the solutions that take in consideration that we can't be, this is a product that we don't know what we are doing here. It's too uncertain. So I think as a society, I would like to see us working together to say, let's stop until, and again, I'm not a business person either. So I realize that this has implications. I just feel that we shouldn't be I feel in the corner on this. I feel like we are being cornered to find, but we don't have the right definitions. We don't, it's not our fault. It's just very complicated. Life is like throwing a new ball to us and, so that's where I am. I appreciate the complexity, and I hopefully you appreciate my frustration on seeing a situation that I think a lot can be more done for the people that are benefiting from selling and marketing these products.
Thank you for that, Jillian and Steve. Anything to add to that?
No, I mean, I would just add, I think the challenge in doing this legislatively is that this can be a very technical issue, and legislators are focused on a range of issues, not just cannabis, as they should be. And it's technical even for people who follow cannabis, let alone for people who are focused on creating laws and policies around a range of content areas. And I think there's some different priorities that different stakeholder groups bring to the table. And this is where, again, I think a task force is really needed to lay those priorities out on the table and have a real conversation about where there's the overlap. I mean, I know the industry is a bit torn on this issue, as we saw in session. On the one hand, what's happening with hemp-derived products, I think, creates some threat to the existing I-502 licensees. The barriers of entry to folks selling hemp-derived products are far lower than the barriers of entry to people who are engaged in the I-502 market. And part of that is around the consumer safety aspects of required testing and packaging and labeling. And so I think the industry's maybe a bit torn, but I think the industry needs predictability. People on all sides of this want to know that what they've invested in is going to go forward with with certainty around it. I know public health and prevention are very concerned about access to youth, which looks very different for hemp-derived products than it does for adult use or medical use cannabis products, where folks who saw the study out of California, there's extremely high compliance with adult-only sales on the I-502 market, as well as California market and in other states. So I think public health and prevention is rightly concerned that hemp-derived products are much more available to youth. Consumers should want reliable safety and certainty in the products that they're consuming, again, whether they're impairing or not. And I think regulators, are seeking to understand how their authority can extend into these hemp-derived products so that they can protect their markets and protect consumer safety. Regulators have resource issues, staffing issues, because this is such a scientific topic. Many regulators don't have the scientific-based staff that I think they wish they did, especially as this topic has come to light. So there are a lot of different, I think, stakeholder priorities on the table, and we need to do some work to make sure we understand where those overlap and how we can get to solutions that everybody can be on board with.
Yeah, thank you for that. Go ahead, Steve.
Oh, I was just going to say, I agree with Jillian's assessment in regard to the risks and the harms associated with youth use. The most simplistic conclusion I draw is I'm curious about why we are so fixated on production as opposed to the product, and how, being as strident as we are in regard to how it's derived, seems to lose any emphasis in regard to what the end product actually is, and what the harms and risks associated with different demographic groups in particular are for those products.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Bea, it looked like you were about to say something. Were you?
No, I wasn't, but I appreciate you bringing that. I can always say something if you want, but thank you,
I
Kathy.
tell in the virtual environment whether someone's just on the verge of saying something, so I just wanted to check. And Steve, I just wanted to circle back. In our pre-meet, we were talking about just the different use of words, and today you brought the kind of that analogy that you made to considering this in the way that we do opioids. Can you talk a little bit more about that simplification? And you just talked about focusing on the end product, and
well, yeah,
I mean, talk a little more about that, please.
Quite simply, there are opioids that are derived directly from natural products. Obviously, the opium poppy comes to mind, and as that industry and that piece of biochemistry became more mature, semi-synthetics were developed, and much more recently, obviously, fully synthetic products are now wreaking an enormous amount of havoc throughout the culture, fentanyl in particular. But they all fall under the same umbrella. They are regulated in the same manner. People acknowledge that not just the manner by which they're produced, but also their psychoactive properties differing in significant ways. Again, in regard to half-life, in regard to potency, in regard to efficacy for a variety of different uses. But nonetheless, it's regulated in a coherent manner by means of putting it all under the same umbrella. And in doing so, again, acknowledging that there are differences between products, but nonetheless more similarities than differences.
And I would just add that there are a range of things that the Food and Drug Administration federally regulates that are like this as well, where they may have a product that, at one threshold can be sold as a dietary supplement, and at another threshold is, pharmaceutical product. And because FDA has authority over all of that, they can sort of see which lane it goes in. So I think that would simplify things. And part of the challenge of us being where we are is that we have this patchwork for how cannabis, one plant, is being regulated across states as different things, hemp or marijuana. And we're ending up with, a patchwork from state to state and a patchwork within states in terms of how the regulations are playing out. Which is going to create challenge for consumer safety, challenges for the industry, and challenges for eventual federal regulation as well. They'll be walking into a landscape where every state has done it a little differently, and I don't know that that's ideal for anyone.
Thank you.
All right, so we've got about 10 more minutes on the panel. Is there anything that we haven't touched on that you'd like to touch on before we move into open questions from our audience?
I mean, I can go on and on, Kathy, about, I think, challenges of this broad issue, but in terms of talking about how to define impairing, no, I think I've covered the challenge from the regulatory perspective.
Sure. And I think, we've heard some really good dialogue today around that, and appreciate the perspectives offered very much.
I find it interesting that the definition for impairing really only is operationalized when it comes to driving motor vehicles. Otherwise, it seems to be an incredibly fuzzy and difficult target to hit. And a state patrolman has a relatively clear idea about what signs and symptoms he or she is looking for to determine whether someone is under the influence as opposed to impaired. And again, just futzing around with the definition for the word impairment, I think really draws more attention than it should, and there are broader considerations to make than simply coming to something's senses, which is almost impossible in this circumstance, in regard to the definition of a single word.
Yeah, Steve, I think that's an excellent analogy. And, many states have landed on 5 nanograms as a threshold for impairing. But, even that has come under question because we don't have good science of, for whom that threshold is actually impairing. And we know that it differs by population. And I think that's one of the reasons that you see, at least on the driving side, you see states using, DRE and A-RIDE officers to try to assess, as you said, symptoms that suggest that somebody is impaired, unable to operate a vehicle safely. Those are much more subjective, and not necessarily objective when we're setting policy. And I think that's the challenge of setting a line in the sand to say, this is impairing, this cannabinoid is impairing, this cannabinoid isn't. For some people where one may not be, it may be for others. And I think that's the challenge. We don't have the science to necessarily back where people want to take this discussion. So appreciate that analogy.
Yep. And that's why I was, going back to the issue about risk instead of impairing, almost without the context of driving vehicles or operating machines, regulating things through the impairment perspective. It could almost bear into, get close to almost a moral topic. It's like people have the right to get impaired in their own home, or people get impaired differently. So I don't see from protecting people from harms a very good word, as you may not be impaired and still be in risk for physical damage. So I don't think it's helpful. And it bugs me, like the moral connotation.
Yeah, we've come full circle to your first point.
Yeah.
We absolutely have. All right.
If you want to look at another family of drugs, another category of drugs that differ wildly, but still are seen, at least by federal regulators, as under a single umbrella, look at hallucinogens, which again are also synthetically produced and naturally derived, very unbelievably wildly in regard to their the manner in which they may or may not impair human beings. And regardless of the variety and the amazing width of differences among the specific elements in that group of drugs, they're still regulated as a single entity.
All right. I'm going to turn back to Justin one more time here, since we've just got a few more minutes for the panel. Any specific questions, Justin, that we haven't touched on that you'd like to offer up real quick before we move on?
Yeah, I think I will throw one out. So as we're looking at these issues, you know, for lack of a better term, we've been talking about impairing, but really, kind of to Steve's point as well, I think one of the things that we're trying to look at from consumer protection issues is what needs to be regulated and what doesn't. So if you look at that one umbrella category for the other drugs, we're very similar in nature for alcohol. Anything above 0.5% alcohol by volume is regulated. Anything that's not isn't. And so with that type of approach in mind, you know, what do you think would be a either excessive amount of THC, let's say, in a product, or what's a threshold that would be less risk to public health and prevention? I mean, where would that sit if you were to hear that there's X amount in a product and you're like, oh my gosh, that's really not safe, you know, especially for youth? What would that look like?
Yeah, Justin, I think I would start by saying that my personal opinion is that any product coming from cannabis should have some regulation for consumer safety. I don't think the regulatory pathway necessarily looks the same across the range of products, but again, just emphasizing that hemp-derived products, whether they are impairing or not, should have a basic threshold of consumer safety testing, of packaging, of labeling. I think that's the responsible thing to do for consumers. In terms of sort of what gets regulated in a higher risk pathway, I think there are a lot of different ways that we could have a discussion about where to draw the line. I'm sure, you know, you all have seen the work that Oregon did. They put out a white paper sort of outlining where they drew the line in the sand in their initial proposed rulemaking on the threshold of an amount of THC that they would deem to be potentially impairing in a way that it would require a certain regulation. They borrowed from sort of how we think about it for alcohol. They borrowed from at a proportion of, you know, an adult use container and looking at that. I think that's an approach that could be taken. I think it's easier probably for most of us to say what clearly is likely to be impairing for most people. So again, just my personal comments, but when the Minnesota legislation passed, you know, a serving size of 5 milligrams of THC, 50 milligrams in a package, there are a lot of people that are going to be impaired off of a single serving of that. And that is going to be available outside of their regulated medical market, and they don't have an adult use market. So, you know, I think that's an example where, you know, many of us probably heard that and said, oh, they just legalized adult use hemp. It's harder to sort of get into the micro categories, and there are all sorts of other challenges around full spectrum products. And that's where, again, I think a task force would be beneficial in sort of building on the work that Oregon's done to think about how that extrapolates. But I think Oregon gave us a good starting point with the white paper that they put together.
Well, and unfortunately, we're still living in this world that is has a deficit in regards to research in this. When you bring up alcohol, it's relatively universally understood that certain blood alcohol levels are generally affect individuals in very similar ways, except for those who may have, you know, unusually bizarre clinical tolerance for one reason or another. And the research it still doesn't meet a standard really in regard to THC. I mean, 5 nanograms, we did that because Colorado did that, and who knows where Colorado got it. And, you know, 10 milligrams per serving, 20 milligrams per serving still feels relatively arbitrary to me, and really isn't based on solid long-term science at this point.
Yeah, but here, you know, if you think about alcohol, I mean, you had a lot of damage caused in societies until prohibition was stated, then to realize later it was a failure. It was, you know, just prohibiting also, you know, create way more crime and injustice that could cause good. And then it was legalized. So you have like century of, you know, a century plus of knowledge built both on try and error of finding solutions and also on research. So we have a new, really, it's, I mean, it's interesting new challenge, how society got so much ahead on producing products as we got from knowing what harms is involved in producing them. And here we are, you know, part we are paying the big, huge price of having prohibition on doing cannabis research and lack of support for better understanding the substance. As a society, we are paying for that because we are blindly trying to do the best we can. And again, the best we can, for me, tells we should pause really seriously.
And some of these compounds coming from hemp, like hexahydrocannabinol and THCO acetate, have literally never been studied in humans. These are products that, you know, the consumers are the test case, which is a little scary from a consumer safety standpoint, and I think makes it even more challenging to have the scientific discussions because they're not compounds that have been studied before at all.
Yeah.
All right, so thanks for that excellent discussion, panelists. And I think we'd like to move now into our participant question session. We'll do this until 2:55. And so I'm going to turn to rules coordinators who've joined today. We've got Jeff Kildall and Robert Despain that are going to call on folks when they've raised their hands or provide a question in the chat box. And I think rules coordinators have been monitoring the chat box. I have not, admittedly. I've been talking to our great panelists here. So Robert and Jeff, do we have questions in the chat box or hands raised?
Hi, Kathy. This is Robert. I just sent you everything prior to 2:30.
Okay.
I don't think there are any questions in there. I think starting at 2:31, we do have a
Yes.
question, and that's from Jim McCrae. Jim, it's rather lengthy. Did you want to? I said your microphone is not working again.
His mic's not working.
Okay. It's pretty long. There's multiple parts within the question and a secondary question. How do you want me to read it out loud or try and pop it on the screen?
Let's see. What do you think, panelists? Would it be easier for Robert to share a screen if it's a long question?
I'm able to find it in the chat. I don't know if others can do that. So I'm looking at it right now already.
Stephen B., are you able to see the question in the chat? I'll try to join you.
Let's see.
Okay, hold on.
I think, you know, Jim's getting back to the question at hand, which I think I previewed in the first few minutes. We were not going to be able to answer as part of the panel, which is how do you define impairing? And I would argue that decisions should be made more on treating this. Again, my personal opinion, not an official position of CANRA, but decisions should be made more on treating cannabis as a single plant regulated by an agency that's looking at the end use of different products. I think we regulate differently if we know products are going to be used by patients that have, you know, may have coexisting conditions and need a certain regulatory pathway. We regulate differently if products are going to be used by adults and, you know, have been earmarked as adult-only products for any variety of reason. And we regulate differently if products are for a general audience of consumers, you know, similar to a dietary supplement. So I would like to see us move more towards the end use of the product and see the regulator be similar across the board. And I'd like to see the regulator get additional resources and staff to help them make those decisions with a multidisciplinary task force, again, considering what's the end goal for how the product's going to be sold and marketed and to whom. I'd like to see us move away from this discussion about what is impairing and what is not. I think that oversimplifies something and doesn't serve the regulatory pathway that's best going to serve consumers and the industry in the long run, in my personal opinion.
Thank you for that, Jillian. I appreciate it very much. Steve or Bia, with respect to Jim's question, and I'm hoping that the two of you can see it as well in the chat. Any feedback, thoughts?
Yeah, I see here a question about risk. Okay. Yeah, so there is a secondary question. Maybe I can say something. So if we must focus on risk, would you all panelists agree that relative to alcohol and nicotine, also regulated by Washington State Liquor Cannabis Board, cannabis represent the least risk alternative for adult use? I don't think that's the point at all. I don't think Liquor Cannabis Board should weigh in the different or make a hierarchy of risk. Basically, we don't know now what cannabis with the evolution of product development of the industry has become anymore. I think most of people that voted to decriminalize the plant wasn't aware they were also voting for a for-profit industry. Clearly, I wasn't. Maybe I was the only one. And also, we weren't aware how the product would be developed and mass-produced and marketed the way it is. So it's appealing. It's a very appealing rationale that cannabis is less risky than these two other products, but I don't think we can say this anymore. We don't have science enough to say it is, as it is today, as is being developed, unregulated, and changed into something else, basically. We can say that the plant that people voted for versus the product that are now being sold are clearly the least risky alternative. So I think we should focus on risk, not risk relative to other products.
And risk, of course, I think really has two dimensions here. One is the physiological risk, where it's clear that alcohol and nicotine are much more riskier than cannabis. But then you're looking at the psychoactive risks, which are different significantly. And nicotine in that case really is not risky in any manner whatsoever. So, and you can debate forever in regard to whether alcohol or THC are riskier in regard to their psychoactive effects on individuals. So it's, you need to decide what dimension you're talking about, and keep in mind that it's not just a single dimension here.
All right, thank you very
Yeah.
much for that. Oh, go ahead, Bea, I'm sorry.
No, good point. Yeah, good point. Just wanted to agree with Steve. Good point, Steve.
Great, thanks very much. So just hoping that if you are not on the panel, if you could turn your camera off, that would be greatly appreciated. Robert, Jeff, I think I see a hand up.
Hi, Kathy.
Hi, yes, the next one was oh, go ahead, Jeff.
Okay, sorry, Robert. Yeah, we have Ryan Bowman has his hand up, so I will go ahead and unmute him.
Thank you, Jeff.
All right, thank you very much for your time. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Thank you all for your expertise. I appreciate the time to be a part of this. You guys all had some great stuff to share. Just some notes that I had as far as what's going on. I think this is a much more complicated situation, like Jillian alluded to. And I think Washington is in a situation where we could be a forerunner in this because it is such a new situation. And we might want to take different approaches than we did in the past. I disagree with the idea of umbrellaing in an opioid regulatory way, since opioids have shown that that regulation has led to a lot of overdoses, and that regulation hasn't had very good track record. So to follow that track record is ill-advised, in my opinion. So I think we might have an opportunity here to move forward regulating the hemp plant in mass and having an entire agency specifically to that, being that the hemp plant has so many different uses. that are exceptionally beneficial for our economy, our infrastructure, logistics, as well as medically in a lot of different ways. And the THC and the psychoactive thing and this impairment problem we're discussing today is a very small portion of that. Like really, when you look at the larger scale of what we could take advantage of here for ourselves as a state, it's a minor part of the iceberg. And I think that if we were advantageous to build an entire agency that had more knowledge about this stuff, there is a lot of research, actually. There is over 50, 70 years of research around this plant that seems to not be known because it's kind of been skipped over here. I've spent a lot of time being a part of this for my own personal. I have seizures, so I had to dive deep into what this really is and where this comes from and the history behind it. And it goes back a long way. And I think that if we had people that were devoted to that knowledge that does exist and diving in there and building a coalition around it, we'd be able to find a quicker route to this issue, to how we can profit from it, how we can regulate it, and how we can move forward
Ryan?
in an advantageous way.
Can I jump in? Is that okay, Justin?
Yeah, I was just going to ask, is there a question in that? Because the deliberative dialogue is intended to ask our panelists questions, not to have participants use it as a platform. So if you have a question, please frame the question, but if not, we'll ask folks to refrain from that approach. Thank you.
Thanks, Justin.
I was just gonna jump in, Ryan. Thanks for the comment. I want to clarify. So in states that I was talking about where they have put it under one umbrella, what they've put under the umbrella from hemp are hemp-derived products. So products like for human consumption. So hemp as a plant and hemp products that are not for human consumption, textiles, rope, microgreens, etc. Those are all still being regulated by, in most cases, the Department of Agriculture, where that's what they know and that's what they do. It's the hemp-derived products for human consumption that are coming under the same umbrella as medical and adult use cannabis. Not that they will be regulated in at all the same way, but it's the same regulator, so they can determine what belongs in what pathway. I think, if we were to say, create a separate agency for hemp than for medical and adult use cannabis, you still have to draw the line in the sand somewhere, because you still have to separate out what belongs to whom and make it a clear distinction so you don't have this gray gap area again. And I think that's the challenge, is where do you draw that line? Can every state draw it the same? There's not federal engagement in drawing it. I think, we've covered hopefully well on this panel the challenges with that. But appreciate the perspective and wanted to just clarify what I meant when I said all under one umbrella. It's really the hemp-derived products for human consumption that are under the umbrella in New York and Michigan right now.
Thank you very much, Jillian. Also wanted to address a statement, it's posed as a question from Sean Dene that says, other than the dialogues, what other input is being considered in preparation for new laws and rules? And again, we are posing questions to the panel about their areas of expertise. If you'd like to submit that question to our rules inbox, we'd be happy to provide you with a response to that. So is there, I think I saw another hand go up, Jeff and Robert.
Hi, Kathy. Yes, we have Bonnie Joe Peterson with her hand up, so I will go ahead and unmute her.
Thank you.
Okay, go ahead, Bonnie Joe.
Okay, thank you. Hello, Bonnie Joe Peterson. I'm the Executive Director and founder of the Industrial Hemp Association of Washington, and I work in the hemp realm, both in Washington State as well as other states. And I was heavily involved with writing the hemp program that passed in 2019. And so that's kind of my background, as well as was involved with multiple pieces of legislation up to this point. But specifically, Jillian, when we're talking about, the structure and function, what actually, gets people high past that CB1 receptor, is there something specific that you feel that a task force should be discussing in that realm, since there is a hemp and food task force about to start?
Yeah, I mean, I think there could certainly be more discussions about should we define impairing, and if so, how. I'm just arguing from my perspective, I see that as being challenging, but I think we need to have discussions about how should these products be regulated and how should they be regulated with a base consumer safety perspective in mind, and then sort of what are the tiers or layers of regulation that some products might warrant that are different or beyond that, and why. And I think that's where, you know, we need a multidisciplinary task force that includes industry, that includes public health prevention, that includes regulators, that includes scientists. I mean, I could go on. I think, you know, that's what Colorado has outlined. So, yeah, I hope that helps answer a little bit of what I would like to see a task force take up.
Thank you.
Steve or Bea, thanks, Bonnie Jo. Steve or Bea, any feedback you'd like to offer there as well? No,
Thank
okay. Thank you. Just wanted to check in. I think I see some more hands up, or those hands that we've already called on and not responded to.
Those are both still Ryan and Bonnie Joe Peterson's hands.
Okay, so all hands are down. Any more questions in the chat that we haven't seen?
No questions, just
Oh,
comments.
sorry, Robert.
No, sorry. No questions.
Okay.
Joanna just posed a question at 2:46. So while we were speaking, have you adopted a clear definition of psychoactive? Again, that's not to the panelists. I think that's more.
Yeah, Joanna. Yeah, is that to the agency or to our panelists?
I mean, I would just chime in and say that I stay away from the term psychoactive, because psychoactive means it works on the brain, and effectively most cannabinoids work on the brain in some way. It doesn't mean that they're impairing. I think for a while I was using psychotropic to refer to things that were impairing, but I know that there are challenges with how that term is used as well. So I can't speak to what you all have done at LCB, Kathy, but just wanted to give that caveat that I think psychoactive is a really broad term, and one that probably isn't of huge service as we talk about, you know, how to regulate, what to regulate.
Yeah, agreed. And Joanna, to your question, no, the agency has not defined psychoactive. I think it was something that was originally introduced in legislation earlier this year, and then based on trying to define it, trying to understand what it went, the agency moved to impairing. So these are very hard definitions to get our arms around, and I think sort of suggests that there's a different way we need to approach both of those things. Go ahead.
Yeah,
Dan.
I agree as well. Yeah. Some people have used mind altering as maybe, you know, so CBD is psychoactive as it is THC, but CBD doesn't cause quote unquote impairment, or is not mind altering, but it's too fuzzy, and it's hard. But I mean, people still use them and it's okay. Usually probably use as mind altering, but I wouldn't be my choice.
Yeah, agreed. Steve, any thoughts? You want to close the loop on that question at all?
No, I feel like we should all sit down with an enormous thesaurus and try to figure out what the hell we're talking about.
Yeah.
I think that's something we talked about in our pre-meet, all these nouns and verbs, what do we do with them? Yes.
And Kathy, I just wanted to bring up a point from the chat that I think is a good and important one. Sean Dene writes that, you know, keep in mind hemp seeds, you know, hemp oil is used in food products for human consumption. I'm a regular consumer of hemp milk as a vegetarian. So yeah, I think those are not the kind of products that we're talking about. Those are not the products under the umbrella for Michigan and for New York. It's manufactured hemp products that are not in the vein of hemp seed oil or hemp milk. But again, I think this is, this is exactly where a task force is needed to make sure that those definitions are clear, that something doesn't accidentally end up with the wrong regulator, that we're really talking about dietary supplements and beyond under that umbrella.
Right, different things. I think I see another Bonnie Joe's hand up again. Jeff or Robert, we may have a new question.
Hi, Kathy. I'll see if Bonnie Joe has a question here.
Okay, thank you.
Okay,
Hello, yes, Bonnie Joe again. Just kind of something that's been, discussed throughout the last session was, instead of a word, a class system, like a class A, class B, or something of that sort, to put the end products into a specific category. And wanted to hear your thoughts around that.
Yeah, Bonnie Joe, I think that's what I personally think is needed here, is something like that. And a task force is needed to help figure out what goes in which class, why. But I guess my point is that I see it being more advantageous to have the same regulator over all of those, like we have FDA over, a bunch of products that we all consume day to day that may end up in different classes based on what the product is. As opposed to sort of figuring out what's in class A and B and C, and then saying, this agency, you regulate class A, this agency, you regulate class B, this agency, you regulate class C, because inevitably new things will come up in innovation that may be between a B or a C or not clearly fit in a B or a C. And if there's not an umbrella over all of that, we end up where we are now, which is with a bunch of products that aren't regulated by anybody, that have fallen between the regulatory cracks and are, presenting consumer safety risk. But yeah, I think that's exactly where my mind is going, that you would have sort of different classes, different tracks, and that a task force would meet to figure out what belongs where, and to reassess new products as they come out as well, that may not clearly fit into what's, the predetermined pathway.
Thank you, John.
Again, my own independent individual perspectives, want to make it clear, speaking for any organization or state.
Thank you for that qualifier. I appreciate it. All right, any other hands up, Robert or Jeff? I think I see a hand up, but I don't know if that's a residual hand or not.
Hi, Kathy. It looks like it's Sean Dene, so I will unmute.
Okay.
Go ahead, Sean.
If someone's speaking, I can't hear anyone.
Nor can I.
Yeah, I can't seem to unmute Sean. Robert, could you try to unmute Sean?
The mute unmute function is not operational on Sean's.
There we go.
There you go.
Okay.
Sorry
Thanks,
about
Sean.
that. Went into a corner, hid for me. So this is a question for the panel. We all know that drug development has to go through the FDA. What do you think about, we've all heard of the entourage effect and whole plant medicine, and now we have isolates and distillates and, in high concentrations. What do you all think of going the path of, designer medicine, using cannabinoids in different varying effects done in a lab, whether it's synthesis or not, but have to go through the drug development path on these novel cannabinoids, that wouldn't be considered part of the whole plant?
Akin to FDA approval process?
Mm-hmm.
Wow. I don't know if we need more bureaucracy, frankly.
Yeah,
But would that make sense to you? I mean, would that be a line that, we've got whole plant and the natural plant over here, and then we've got drug development over here on this side? We certainly have a path for drug development in this country.
Yeah, I don't have a good answer for you, Sean, but I do, I hear you. And I think there are a bunch of different decision points, especially around not found in nature cannabinoids that are coming out that are not analogous to anything that we see in the plant. I also think, I have a lot of questions about biosynthetic cannabinoids that are coming out. The biosynthetic process is usually something that FDA's regulating. So we've not seen much action at all from FDA. So I don't think anyone's holding their breath for FDA to get in the game here. And I think that's exactly why you're seeing states try to figure out what are they doing with these things. And my concern is that every state's going to take a slightly different approach because that's what they get through their legislature. That's what their coalitions come up with. And we may see some states that end up banning biosynthetic products or banning not found in nature products. And we may see other states that, create a legal pathway for them on their medical or adult use markets. And I think that patchwork is again, not going to serve anybody well. So I don't have a good answer for you. I think you're raising the right questions. And I wish that we had a broader coalition. One of the things that we're working on at CANRA is to have broader conversations at the national level around these topics to try to understand, can we get some movement nationally so that we don't end up with a state by state patchwork. But it's tough when there aren't federal agencies taking the regulatory reins.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for your question.
Appreciate your input.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I want to comment on that too. I think there are a couple of things. I mean, I think, again, we are paying for the prohibition of the plant for such a long time. And there is a huge path from drug development on the cannabis plant itself and on, chemically derived or even chemically produced cannabinoids for medicine. And there is no doubt about it, and is underdeveloped particularly in the United States. There's, you have substance like Sativex that are, it's like sold in 42 countries or more, and it's still not available in the United States. So this is, I just think this is unrelated to this other bigger issue of having products being sold not as a medicine or developed as a medicine for for mind altering purposes without any regulation, any age gating. So it's a different thing. Am I in favor of having people investing on cannabis as a medicine? You bet. There will be problems with the medicine. You bet. There is no medicine that is just like a totally solution for all the, the issues of mankind. But I think that's the right path that I would like. So with prohibition at federal level, big labs won't invest on this either because they can't. FDA would not entertain this path either. So we are in a bind. And I think still this is unrelated to the question at hand, that is this product's being sold to kids in drugstores.
All right, thank you very much, Bia. So we have 2 minutes left in this session, and it looks like we had one additional question come in from Scott. Sir, we're going to have to respond to your question by way of email. So we've taken it down. I will send the question to our panelists so that they can respond in that way. In the chat box, I've put our rules email address. It's in the materials that were sent out for this meeting today. If you have any follow-up questions concerning our discussion today that you'd like LCB to provide to our panelists, we're happy to share those forward with them. And again, if you'd send those questions to rules@lcb.wa.gov, we will follow up with them on those questions. And Scott, I don't have your email address, but if you would send your question to Rules, we'll have a way to get that question answered and a response provided to you. So appreciate that very much. That's one thing Teams doesn't provide us with is folks' emails address. So thanks very much for that. So we can stay on time today and close on time. I'd again like to extend our gratitude to our fantastic panelists today. Bia, Jillian, Steve, thank you so much for the gift of your time and expertise today. We really appreciate it. We do look forward to continuing this conversation it's a big topic, and I think we're going to be working with it for quite some time. And we look forward to the opportunity to continue to work with the three of you and all of you on this call in the future. Briefly handing it over to Justin for any closing remarks, and then we'll sign off for today.
Well, just again, thank you all for engaging with us today and answering the questions from not only the prescribed questions, but also the participants. Obviously, a very complex issue that we're trying to navigate on behalf of the state, and there's really no easy solution. So we really appreciate the input that you've given us, and that way we can take a number of different perspectives into consideration as we're drafting up our thoughts and moving forward and seeing where the agency would like to go. So again, thank you. And I would like to thank the participants as well for your engagement, your time, and the questions that you posed. So thank you very much all.
All right, and with that, we will sign off. Everyone have a great afternoon, and we look forward to speaking with you and working with you soon.
Thank you.
Thank
guys.
you.
Everyone.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Bye.